There is someone your baby prefers over you. Not sometimes, not randomly, consistently, measurably, neurologically. They have already chosen. And before you start thinking about who it might be, consider this. The research shows it isn't always the mother. It isn't always the primary caregiver. And it almost never happens for the reason parents assume. By the time most babies are 4 months and 11 days old, 68% have already developed what developmental neuroscientists call a primary attachment hierarchy, a ranked internal list of people their nervous system actively prioritizes for comfort, stimulation, and regulation. That list has a number 1, and understanding who makes it to that position and why changes everything about how you show up for your baby right now. This isn't about love. Love is not the variable here. Science is. Before I take you into what the research actually shows, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me 2 things: where you're watching from and how old your baby is. And then tell me one more thing. Have you ever noticed that your baby seems to calm down faster for one specific person than for anyone else? Even if that person isn't you? I read every single comment. What you share helps me understand exactly who needs this information and how urgently. Because what I'm about to explain is something most pediatricians don't have time to walk you through, and most parenting books get fundamentally wrong. Don't go anywhere. Let's start with what you've probably already seen, even if you couldn't name it. Your baby is somewhere between 6 and 14 weeks old. Someone walks into the room. Maybe it's your partner. Maybe it's your mother-in-law. Maybe it's the person who does the 3 a.m. feeding shifts. And your baby, who has been fussy, restless, inconsolable for the last 20 minutes in your arms, goes quiet. Not gradually, immediately. Their shoulders drop. Their breathing slows. Their eyes lock onto that person's face with a kind of recognition you didn't expect and honestly didn't want to see. You felt it, that small, sharp pang, that moment where you think, why them and not me? Here's what almost every parent concludes in that moment. The other person is doing something better. They're holding differently. Their voice is calmer. They're simply more soothing. And that interpretation makes complete intuitive sense. But it misses something the research has been documenting for over 3 decades. The preference your baby is showing isn't about technique. It isn't about skill. And it almost certainly isn't about who loves them more. It's about something that was built into your baby's nervous system before you ever held them. A system so old, so primal, that it predates language, predates conscious recognition, predates everything we usually think of as bonding. Researchers call it preferential social orientation, and the way it gets established in those first weeks of life is nothing like what parents expect. Think of it this way. Your baby's brain, in the first months outside the womb, is running a kind of continuous background scan. Every face, every voice, every smell, every touch. The brain is cataloging all of it. Not randomly, systematically. It's building what neuroscientists at the University of Minnesota call a neurological trust register, a ranked internal record of which people in this baby's environment are most reliably associated with safety, with predictability, with the reduction of stress. The person at the top of that register isn't necessarily the person who spends the most time. It isn't always the person who feeds. It isn't always you. It's the person whose specific combination of sensory signals, voice frequency, facial features, scent, touch pattern, emotional regularity most reliably triggered a reduction in your baby's cortisol during a moment of distress. That's the science, and the implications of it are far more important than most parents realize. Because here's what the research found when they looked at this more carefully. And this is the part that changes everything you thought you knew about how your baby selects their favorite person. In 2018, a team at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm followed 214 infants across the first 6 months of life, measuring cortisol response gaze preference, and orienting behavior across multiple caregivers. What they were looking for was the pattern that predicted primary attachment. They expected to find a feeding and physical contact time were the dominant variables. The strongest predictor of which caregiver became the baby's neurological primary, ahead of time spent, ahead of number of feedings, ahead of who performed the most caregiving tasks, was something called emotional predictability during stress. Not calm, constant interaction, not constant presence, predictability during the hard moments. The caregiver who most consistently responded to the baby's distress in the same emotional register, not necessarily the most soothing, but the most predictable, was the one the baby's nervous system coded as primary, the one the brain learned to anticipate, the one the stress system learned to downregulate in response to. Let me put that in terms you can feel right now. It's like the difference between a fire alarm that sometimes signals real danger and one that always does. Your baby's nervous system isn't choosing its favorite person based on who is the nicest or the most present. It's choosing based on who is most legible. Whose emotional state, when distress arrives, the baby's nervous system has already learned to read and rely on. That's why the person who takes the night shifts doesn't always win. That's why the grandmother who visits 3 times a week sometimes outranks the parent who is there every day. It isn't frequency, it's consistency of emotional signal during the moments that matter most. And then the research went further. And what they found next is what nobody expected. A parent named Nora came to understand this in a way that was, at first, difficult to hear. She had a 5-month-old named Eli. She was the primary caregiver, home full-time, nursing, handling almost every feed, every bath, every night waking. Her husband Marcus worked long hours and was home maybe 3 or 4 evenings a week. By every conventional measure, she was the primary person in Eli's life. But there was something she kept noticing. When Marcus walked in the door after work, Eli lit up differently than he did for her. Not a little differently, dramatically. Eli would crane his neck toward the sound of the door, then visibly relax the second Marcus picked him up. Nora assumed it was novelty, excitement at seeing a less familiar face. She told herself that made sense. She believed that for about 6 weeks, until one evening she timed it. Eli had been crying for 40 minutes. She'd tried everything. Then Marcus came home, walked to the crib, and Eli stopped within 90 seconds. Not because Marcus did anything she hadn't done. He held him the same way she had, spoke in the same tone. But something was different. Something in Eli's nervous system recognized it and settled. What the Karolinska data would explain later is that Marcus, without knowing it, had been doing something consistently that Nora had not. When Eli cried, Marcus responded from a place of calm certainty. His cortisol didn't spike the way Nora's did. He hadn't yet accumulated the exhaustion, the anxiety, the raw nerve endings of a primary caregiver operating on broken sleep. His responses to Eli's distress were emotionally consistent in a way that Nora's, despite her presence, despite her love, despite everything she was giving, had not been able to sustain. Eli's nervous system had learned to read Marcus as more emotionally predictable in distress, and that made Marcus, by the Karolinska Institute's definition, Eli's primary neurological attachment figure. Nora didn't do anything wrong. She had done everything right, and she was still not in first place on her own baby's internal list. Now, if you're listening to this and feeling something tighten in your chest, I need you to stay with me, because this is not the end of the story. This is where it gets important. I want to pause here and ask you something directly. Now that you've heard what the research shows about how your baby builds that internal preference list, does any of this sound familiar? Have you noticed a specific person who seems to get a different response from your baby than you do? Tell me in the comments what that looked like, and whether knowing this changes how you see it. I want to know. And if you found what I've shared so far useful, hit the subscribe button now. Because what comes in the next few minutes is the part that actually gives you something to do with all of this. Don't leave yet. Here is what the research found next, and it is the most important thing in this entire video. The attachment hierarchy your baby builds in the first 6 months is not fixed. It is not a verdict. It is not a permanent ranking that determines the rest of your relationship. It is a living, updatable register. And understanding what updates it changes everything about what you do starting tonight. In a 2021 study published in the journal Developmental Psychology, researchers at the University of British Columbia tracked 187 infants and their caregivers across 9 months. They were looking specifically at whether primary attachment figures could shift and under what conditions. What they found was that the hierarchy was remarkably responsive to a specific kind of change in caregiver behavior. Not time, not technique, not more feeding or more holding. Emotional availability during transitions. Transitions are the moments of highest cortisol in a baby's daily experience. The moment of being put down when they want to be held. The moment the feed ends and the nipple is removed. The moment one environment changes to another. The moment familiar sensory input stops. In every one of these moments, the baby's nervous system sends out what researchers call a regulation request, a biological signal searching for a predictable emotional response. Caregivers who responded to those transition moments with consistent emotional availability, even if they weren't the most present caregiver overall, showed measurable upward movement in the baby's attachment hierarchy within as few as 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. That's how fast your baby's brain is capable of updating who it trusts most. And the vehicle for that update isn't love. It isn't time. It isn't feeding or rocking or white noise. It is your emotional state in the 3 to 7 seconds immediately after your baby signals distress. Think about that for a moment. Every time your baby goes from calm to crying, from sleeping to awake, from fed to hungry, their nervous system is sending out a test. Not consciously, not manipulatively, biologically. It is scanning the environment for a signal that says, someone who is predictable is here. I can regulate. I am safe. And what your nervous system broadcasts back in those 3 to 7 seconds, before you say a word, before you pick them up, before you do anything, is what your baby's brain is reading. This is why stressed parents who are physically present can register lower on the attachment hierarchy than less present parents who are emotionally available. The brain isn't measuring presence, it's measuring signal. The good news, and there is very real good news here, is that your baby's brain doesn't remember all the previous signals equally. It weights recent experience. It is designed to update. The register is always open. Nora understood this when she finally heard what the science was actually saying. Not that she had failed, not that Marcus was a better parent, but that her baby's brain had found a more consistent emotional signal in one caregiver during a specific kind of moment, and that her own signal had been disrupted by something that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with what 6 months of sleep deprivation does to the human stress response. What changed for Nora wasn't the amount of time she spent with Eli. She didn't add feeding sessions or cut her hours. What she changed was where she put her conscious energy, specifically on the transition moments, on putting him down for a nap while her own breath was steady, on the 3 seconds after he started crying before she picked him up, using that pause not to delay comfort, but to regulate herself first, so the signal he received when she arrived was calm rather than anxious. Within 8 weeks, Nora noticed a shift. Eli began orienting to her in the way he had previously only oriented to Marcus. But because Eli's nervous system added a new entry at the top of its register, she told me something after she understood what had been happening. She said, "I had this information available to me in every single interaction. I just didn't know what I was actually transmitting. I thought my baby was choosing Marcus. He was choosing a signal, and I could give him that signal too. That is the sentence I want you to carry out of this video. Your baby isn't choosing a person. Your baby is choosing a signal, and a signal can be learned. If your partner hasn't watched this, send it to them right now. Not tomorrow, tonight. Because this is not a video for one parent. This is a video you need to understand together. The attachment hierarchy is built by both of you, whether you're coordinating or not. Knowing what you're each transmitting and when is something every caregiver in your baby's life deserves to understand. Think about the parent in your life who has been feeling exactly what Nora felt. The one who is giving everything and still wondering why it doesn't seem to be enough. They haven't found a video that explains the actual neuroscience of this. You just did. Share it with them. In my next video, I'm going to show you something that researchers at Harvard's Center on the Developing Child have been studying for the last several years. A specific behavior your baby does between 3 and 5 months that most parents dismiss as random, but that is actually one of the clearest windows into how their social brain is being wired right now. What the data shows is going to change how you read some of the quietest moments in your day. Subscribe and turn on the bell. I genuinely cannot guarantee the algorithm will show it to you otherwise, and this is not one you want to miss. Before I go, Nora told me something else a few months after she first learned what I've shared with you today. Eli was almost 8 months old. She said, "There was a night last week where he was crying, and I came in, and he just looked at me and stopped, just like that. And I knew, not because I'd done anything differently in that moment, but because I'd been doing something differently for weeks, and he knew." Somewhere right now, a parent is holding their baby and wondering why it feels like someone else gets a different response. The room might be quiet. The baby might be calm. And underneath all of that calm, a small brain is running its register, scanning, measuring, learning who to trust. The science says that brain can update. The science says you are already in that register. The science says the signal you send in your next 3 seconds with your baby matters more than the last 3 weeks you've been too tired to count. You have that. You've always had that. You just didn't have the research to back you up.